So this morning I want to begin by talking about life script analysis. And this is a way of becoming aware of the unconscious life plan that we formed in childhood so that we can take a look at that. And if we don't like the plan that we developed for ourselves, we can change that. The goal is to become autonomous so that you can make clear choices about the way you want to live your life and not be directed by an unconscious plan that's really outside of your awareness. So Byrne's definition of a life script is a person's life plan concerning what of significance will happen to them in their life, which they decided upon in childhood, and of which they are likely to be unaware in the present. So the whole goal is to bring that into awareness so you have conscious choice. Byrne was a poker player, and he often used analogies from poker. So he talked about three basic types of life scripts. The first were winners, and he said winners are people who accomplish the goals they set for themselves. And the Gouldings added, and make the world a better place as a result. Because there are some criminals who accomplish the goals they set for themselves, but they wreak a lot of havoc in the process. The second type are losers. And losers are people who don't accomplish the goals they set for themselves. So winning and losing is really relative to the goals people set. If my goal in life is to become President of the United States and I only become Vice President, I'm a loser. If my goal in life is to become custodian of this building and I do that, I'm a winner. Sometimes people set themselves up to be losers by setting impossible goals, like being perfect, for example, which is not possible. So winning and losing are relative to the goals one sets for their life. The third category are non-winners. And non-winners are people who sometimes win and sometimes lose, but never very big in either direction, because their primary investment is staying safe, playing it safe, not taking risk. So they simply try to keep up with the Joneses and don't ever risk very much in either direction. Claude Steiner called those types of scripts banal scripts. Byrne also talked about certain time patterns that you will see in scripts. And he used analogies from Greek mythology to describe these. One is the always script, and you hear that reflected in people's language. Why does this always happen to me? And that's symbolized in Greek mythology by Arachne, who was a woman who did something to displease the gods, and she was turned into a spider, doomed to be always spinning her web throughout eternity. A second time pattern is never. I can never get what I want. And that's symbolized in Greek mythology by Tantalus, who again did something to displease the gods, was put in this room with all these other people, and there was all this food and drink, but their arms weren't quite long enough to reach it, and they were, quote, tantalized. That's where that term comes from. And then there's the after script. You can have fun now, but you just wait till you have children. or whatever. So the person has permission to enjoy themselves, but after a certain point, they're supposed to pay. And that's symbolized in Greek mythology by Damocles, who was a very happy, successful king until one day he looked up above his head and he saw a sword suspended by a single horsehair. And after that point, he could never be happy again because he lived in constant dread of when that horsehair was going to break and the sword fall on his head. You probably heard the term, the sword of Damocles. That's where that comes from. And then there's the until script. Basically, you can't have fun or enjoy your life until you get all your work done. And of course, you can always find something else you haven't done. And that's symbolized in Greek mythology by several people, Hercules, Jason, and Ulysses, who all had all these tasks they had to do before they could go home and resume a normal life. So people with an until script keep postponing fun and enjoyment to the future. And then the fifth type is called an almost, or over and over again. And you hear people say things like, well, I almost made it this time. And that's symbolized in Greek mythology by Sisyphus, who rolls the stone up the hill, gets it almost to the top, makes one little mistake, and it rolls down again. And he just keeps doing that over and over again. And many people do that in their lives. And then the final one is an open-ended script. And this one has to do with people having direction about what to do up to a certain point, and then the script runs out. For example, women often have information about being a good wife and mother, but once the kids leave home, they don't know what to do with themselves. Or men have a script regarding work, but once they retire, they don't know what to do with themselves. This is symbolized in Greek mythology by Philemon and Bacchus, who were a elderly couple who lived by the edge of town, and the gods came wandering through their town, described as or disguised as weary strangers, and nobody would take them in. And so this couple took them in and fed them and let them spend the night. And as a reward, when the gods got up to leave the next morning, since they were about at the end of their life, they turned them into laurel trees planted by the side of the road with their limbs entwined forever throughout eternity. And they were given a place of great prominence in that the leaves of their trees, the laurel tree, was used as the ceremonial wreath for the Olympian athletes. It's kind of a dubious reward, if you ask me, but that's where that comes from. So you will see all of these 6 time patterns frequently in people's scripts. Now I want to talk a little bit about how the script evolves and use what's called the script matrix, which was developed by Claude Steiner as a way of talking about this. So in the script matrix, and actually what I'd like to have you do is get a clean sheet of paper and just construct a matrix for yourself, with yourself at the center, and then Father slightly elevated to the right with his 3 ego states, Mother slightly elevated to the left with her 3 ego states. If anybody needs paper, they're pads. Thank you. there are two types of messages that we receive from parents and other significant people in our life as we're growing up. One set of messages are directives from mother and father's parent ego state that are incorporated into our parent. And these are mostly messages about what we should do in order to be a fine, upstanding member of the community and somebody the family would be proud of. And these are referred to as counter injunctions. And I'll explain more about why they call that later when we talk about injunctions. And there are a specific set of these that are called drivers, which were identified by Tabby Kaler. And I'll share more about those in a minute. The other set of messages that we get are on the psychological level. And these are given out by mother and father's child ego state as they react in a certain way to our behavior. And we pick these up as mother and father's child gets excited. And there are two ways they can get excited. They can be positively excited, in which case we get what are called permissions. It's okay for you to do whatever. And you might think about, for example, parents getting very excited when their child performs musically, or when they do well in school, or do well in sports, or they're cute and entertaining, or they're clever and ingenious. And when parents get excited about these things, the child gets permissions that it's okay to do that and really excel in those areas. When mother and father's child gets negatively excited, they get what are called injunctions. Don't messages. I can't stand it when you do such and such. Because the parent is feeling some threat about what the child is doing. For example, if mother and father never learn to be close, they may get frightened when the child gets too close. And their reaction implies to the child, don't get close. An injunction against closeness. Or if father never felt successful, when he sees son doing well, he might point out son's mistakes so that son doesn't feel successful. And the message is, don't succeed, or don't make it, or certainly don't outdo me. And we'll talk more about the different types of injunctions in a minute. Parents often also model in their own behavior how to carry out these injunctions. For example, if the injunction is don't be close, they show the child how not to be close by staying distant. Claude Steiner drew that from adult to adult. I think it's really little professor modeling. I think the part of the parent who's really showing the child how to carry out these injunctions is really the child within mother or father. The example Steiner used to illustrate this was the parent who says, don't think, drink, to obliterate problems. And the here's how message, adult to adult, is here's how to mix martinis. And so that would be an example of adult to adult. But I think most of the program we get is not part of mother or father's awareness, because they're modeling how to not make it, or how not to be close, or how not to succeed, or whatever. And I don't think that's adult. I think it's coming from their little professor. So what I'd like for you to do is think about the primary directives you got from mother or father about what you should do to be a fine, upstanding member of the community and somebody the family would be proud of, and just put them in above the lines, either on mother's side or father's side. And these are messages like, be good, get a good education, marry well, be a good Catholic or Jew or Christian or Muslim or whatever. Anything the parents believed was important in terms of being a success in life and being somebody the family would be proud of. Another one that's very common is work hard. So just think for a moment about what your mother's main message was and your father's main message, and just put those above the line, depending on who they came from. People have some additional examples you want to share? Yes.
I'm not talking about a verbal message from my mother.
Usually it's verbal, sometimes it's nonverbal.
Okay.
The parent may just model it.
Okay, so from my mother, I would say stay busy.
Mm-hmm.
If that's
Okay.
a message. But
Yes.
That's what they got. Okay.
So stay busy. Other examples? Thank you. Yes.
I got a general message of be responsible,
Uh-huh.
be invisible.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Other people?
I had a main message of keep calm and please others.
Mm-hmm. Good.
My mother got it from her father that you should surround everything you do with the elements of success.
Uh-huh. Good.
Well, I have a similar thing that comes from several generations. To be good, to be upright, to be responsible. But what's significant to me is that I'm getting this from my mother,
Mm-hmm.
who could be very emotional about it, who got it at least from her mother, and presumably from her father. But at any rate, it's more than one generation.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the message is keep the family legacy.
Uh-huh.
So
Good. So you get a sense of what these messages are like, and they're often passed along generationally, as you hear. And sometimes they sort of go without saying. Like if everybody in the family for 6 generations had been a doctor, they don't even have to say it. It's just automatically expected that to be a success, you become a doctor, or a lawyer, or whatever, or an educator. So these kinds of messages get passed along through the parent ego state, generation after generation. So next I want you to think about any things that mother or father got positively excited about that you did as a kid, like getting good grades or performing musically or sports or whatever. And then write those in above the lines coming from mother or father's child. And the form to write it in is it's okay to do well in sports or school or whatever. See what you come up with. Again, are people willing to share some examples of what you came up with? Okay, here's the mic.
I just found out whatever is my script is not from my father and mother. It's because they put me in a boarding school, and whatever I decided is there. I decided to because it was all rules are there, and I decided there whenever I grow up, I don't put anything in the right place. And I decided, because I didn't see my mom and dad, I decided to don't miss anyone.
Uh-huh.
And to please others, because I was the youngest than the others. So although I liked my food, I always said I don't like it, and I gave it to other people. So I have this, please others. And
In terms of permissions, were there things they got positively excited about, excel in this area or whatever?
yeah, and because I was so much being controlled all the time at the right time, I just don't want to be controlled.
Okay. Were there, yeah, good. Okay. So who had an example of a permission that you got?
From my dad, I got "It's okay to pursue your dreams."
Mm-hmm.
He was a rock gospel singer and traveled around the country.
Uh-huh.
And from my mom, I got "It's okay to be yourself, to be different."
Great. Nice messages. Over here.
It was interesting. My father, on one hand, was saying you have to focus on education, and the other hand, if I did little, I got scored less in my exam. He said it's okay as long as you did your best. So it was a conflict of permission and injunction for me. So
Yeah.
I took the best of both now, I guess.
Right. Okay. But that's nice permission, that as long as you do your best, you don't have to do it perfectly. You can be good enough. Yeah. Good. So you get a sense of what those messages are like. I'd like for you to go back to the counter injunctions for a minute, and there are 5 of these that are universal that Tabby Kaler identified. These carry with them a conditional sense of okayness. It's like you can be okay if, and one of these is be perfect. You can be okay if you're just perfect. Another one is be strong. You can be okay if you're just strong enough. Another one is try hard. You can be okay if you just try hard enough. Another one is please others. You can be okay if you please others enough. And then hurry up. You can be okay if you just do things fast enough. So I'd like for you to look over that list of 5 and pick out what would be number 1, number 2, possibly number 3 in the order of priority, and just put them above the line from mother and father's parent ego state, depending on who they came from. And see what drivers you may have. Another thing that Tabby pointed out that I think is very useful to know is that when people are moving into the script, the first step is to go into driver behavior. Trying to be perfect, or trying to be strong, or trying hard, pleasing others, hurrying up. When you see that driver behavior, you know that the person is going into script. Yes. Yeah. If as I'm lecturing, I'm just internally focused on covering every single detail perfectly and not making any mistakes and so forth, I would be into script behavior. And I would be not allowing myself to really be free and spontaneous, enjoy teaching and so forth. Both my parents were first children, and they got a lot of emphasis on doing things right. And they both communicated to be perfect to me. They also were reared during the Depression, and my mother grew up on a farm, and they both had an injunction to be strong, endure. And so those are two of the messages I got. I also got to please others from my mother. So we often get a combination of these. And again, these are just passed down generationally through the parent-ego state.
And say a little more about trying hard. What does try hard especially lead to?
Often kids don't get much attention if they do things well the first time. But if they really struggle and, really put a lot of energy into it, mother, father might say, "Attaboy," or "Attagirl, you're really trying hard." So there's a lot of stroking for trying as opposed to doing. It's like I can try to pick up that water, or I can pick it up. Trying hard is putting a lot of energy into it and struggling and so forth, as opposed to simply doing it easily.
Yeah, so there's an element of suffering in
Right.
that, kind of like
And pain.
of pain and
yeah.
yeah.
Right. Okay. What I'd like to focus on next are the injunctions. Again, these are messages from mother and father's child that are picked up by our little professor, the adult and the child. And these are given out when mother and father feel threatened by some behavior on our part. There are behavioral injunctions, there are feeling injunctions and thinking injunctions. Probably the most destructive of the behavioral injunctions is don't be or don't exist. And that's given out when parents have an unwanted child. And I think that infants or kids pick up even in utero the fact that their existence is resented. Later on, when they're born, they hear messages like, if it weren't for you, I wouldn't have had to marry this so-and-so. Or if it weren't for you, I could have gone to graduate school. Or things were fine until you came along. And what's being implied is the child ruined the parent's life by being born. So the implication is don't be or don't exist. And the parents are not consciously aware of what they're implying to the kid. But this is the major injunction behind suicidal behavior. I've never worked with anyone who was suicidal who didn't get a don't be injunction early on. So it's a very destructive message. And kids don't understand death. Death is what happens to the Roadrunner and the Coyote, or the Coyote in the Roadrunner cartoon. You know, you get smashed in one scene, and the next scene you're off hard charging again. That's no threat. What's really a threat is the possibility of losing mother or father's love. So at 3 or 4, to choose death over losing mother or father's love helps the child survive and feel like there's hope. And the fantasy on the part of the child is, once they're dead, they'll be able to lift up the lid on the coffin, see how much mom and dad love them at last, now that they've paid the ultimate price. That's part of the magical thinking of the young child. When the reality is, once you're dead, you don't know what mother or father feel or think or whatever. But it's a magical way to try to get mother and father's love at an early age. Another behavioral injunction is don't be well or don't be sane. In some families, nobody pays attention until the child gets sick. Then they get lots of tender loving care. In other families, nobody pays attention unless the child is acting strange enough. So kids learn very quickly what the parents pay attention to. And as Burns said, what you pay the most attention to, what you stroke, is what gets reinforced. Another injunction behaviorally is don't be you. And that, that can mean several things. If the parents had a boy and they wanted a girl, it can mean don't be the sex you are. If what the child hears at birth is how wonderful the previous child was who died in childhood, the child might try to take that child's place in order to be loved the way the parents love that child. In narcissistic families, it's don't be who you are, live up to this ideal image I have in my head of what you should be. So there are many different things that can mean, but the basic implication is the child is not okay the way they are, and they've got to be somebody else or a different sex or whatever in order to be loved. Another one is don't make it or don't succeed. And that's given out when the child gets more attention for their mistakes than for their successes. Like the child who brings home all A's on their report card and 1 B. And the parents say, why didn't that be an A? Rather than stroke the child for all the A's. Or son is making a model airplane and father stays away until son makes a mistake. And then father comes out and points out the mistake. So the implied message is, if you want my attention, mess up in some way. Make mistakes, don't succeed. Another injunction is don't be close or don't trust. And that's given out when parents are acting in hurtful or betraying ways. The child may decide, I'll stay away from you to protect myself. Sometimes the parents teach the child, you can't trust men, or you can't trust women, or you can't trust anybody outside the family. Sometimes the parents have never didn't get to experience closeness, and when they were growing up, when the child attempts to get close, they get this frightened look on their face. And the child doesn't know what that's about, but knows there's something scary about being close, and learns not to be close. Another injunction is don't grow up. And that's usually given out by parents who either never grew up themselves, and they want the child to stay their playmate, or by parents who define all their worth and value in terms of being good parents. So they keep the child dependent on them and don't allow the child to grow so that the parent can continue to feel good about themselves by providing everything for the child. The opposite of that is don't be a child. And that's usually given out by parents who were reared during the Depression in this country, or on a farm, or in some situation where they believed if you weren't working every minute, you'd starve to death. And so when their kids are just playing and being normal, natural kids, they get anxious and tell the child something to do. And the implication is it's not okay to be a child. You got to hurry up and grow up and achieve in order to be okay. Another one is don't be important. That's given out in families where the parents believe that children should be seen and not heard. What they think or feel is not significant. Only the big folks' opinion counts. Another one is don't belong. And there are two ways that can be given out. The parents may teach the child they're too good to fit into those ordinary people out there, or it may be negative. Parents say, we don't know where we got this when the milkman must have brought him. The implication is the child doesn't fit into the family in some way, or doesn't fit into the outside world. Another one is don't enjoy. In some families, if you're having too much fun, you're obviously sinning, up to no good. In other families, if you're having too much fun, you're not getting your work done. So a lot of times there's an implied injunction against really having fun, enjoying yourself, playing, being spontaneous, and so forth. Sometimes there's a magical belief about that if you have too much fun, if you enjoy yourself too much, something bad is going to happen. So the way you magically ward off evil is not to feel too good. And then you're not caught unaware. Yes?
Just wanted to clarify again in my head, when these injunctions are given, can they when the child actually does show personality to the family script? Because when you don't belong one, it triggered a lot of thinking for me. And I'm wondering, with the social state development, whether that comes after the child actually dares to have their own thoughts and feelings about the world, and all of a sudden the family feels that this is an odd kid.
Yes.
So can don't belong come a lot later?
It can. We can also get it culturally if we're a member of a minority race in the culture. The cultural injunction is don't belong. You don't fit into the rest of the culture.
So we're not only talking...
I'm sorry, your microphone is cutting out.
Now, wow, you have to go really close. We're not talking only 0 to 6 here. We can...
No, kids can get injunctions anywhere from birth all the way up, as long as they're at home. Yeah.
Okay.
Later on, they have enough adult that often they can decide whether they're going to really obey that or not. And oftentimes, grandparents or other figures who may be associated with the child can give the child permission not to pay attention to an injunction if they have another source of stroking and affirmation. Another injunction, especially in alcoholic families or other families where there's something going on, sexual abuse, other things that the parents don't want revealed, there's an injunction not to talk. In alcoholic families, it's the elephant in the living room. You're not supposed to ask questions about your parents drinking. There's a don't talk injunction. And a 12th one is just plain don't. That's given out in phobic families where the parents are afraid for the child to do anything for fear that they're going to get hurt. And they're constantly telling the child, don't do that. And implying that somehow the world is a dangerous place and you got to be really careful in order not to get hurt. The feeling injunctions follow a particular format. There is don't feel period, where the parents don't know what to do with feelings, so they just try to suppress them. A second variation is don't feel X. There may be a certain feeling that's defined as not okay. Like, don't feel angry, that's not polite. Don't feel scared, that's being a sissy. Don't feel sad, that's being a wimp. Don't feel sexual, we don't know what to do with that, or whatever. So there's specific feelings that sometimes get defined as not okay. And the third possibility is don't feel what you feel what I feel. Like the child is seen as an extension of the parent. I'm cold, go put on your sweater. You know, like the child should be feeling exactly the same thing that the parent is feeling. The thinking injunctions follow a similar format. There's don't think period, where the parents want to do all the thinking for the child and not allow the child to think for themselves. And again, another one is don't think X. Like a little child might say, Mother, is there really a God? And mother says, hush, don't ever let me hear you question that again. Like that's not okay to think about. And then don't think what you think what I think. That's usually given out in very rigid families where there's an absolute right-wrong answer for everything. No shades of gray. And you're supposed to buy the party line and think the way the parents think. So differences in thinking are seen as a threat as opposed to adding additional insight or other perspectives. So what I'd like for you to do next is just look through those lists of behavioral and feeling and thinking injunctions. And again, put them on the matrix depending on whether they came from mother or whether they came from father. Just put them under the lines on the matrix. Yes?
Don't enjoy for what is the difference? Why is not don't feel joy? I think it's why is in behavior and not in feeling? What is the difference?
You could express it either way. It would mean the same thing. If you said don't feel joy, it's
there would be a
basically the
feeling
same as-
induction, not.
Yeah. Right. Another question?
I have a question about these injunctions. I'm wondering if, because when I'm thinking in my case, for some of these things, I had exactly these injunctions, and I became completely reverse of that.
Mm-hmm.
So how it works, it is healthy or just something like...
The injunction is only half of it. The other half is what the child decides. So a parent might say, don't make it. One child may decide, I'll try as hard as I can, but I know I'll never really succeed. Another child will decide, I'll show you I can do it even if it kills me.
Just disobeying them because I felt bad when, for example, my mom was telling that think like me, and I decided to think the things completely reverse. You know?
Yes. And again, many kids decide to rebel as opposed to comply with the message. Especially if they have the support of a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle who gives them permission to be different.
Van, can you briefly describe what's the difference between the counter injunctions and the injunctions? Like in the injunctions, I can say, okay, don't talk, don't be close, or don't trust. But like for the counter injunctions, I put keep family secrets. So I can see that those two are linked. Would that be a counter injunction in that it's kind of rhymed in the injunctions then?
Yes, sometimes the counter injunctions will be consistent with the injunction like that. But oftentimes, the injunctions are much earlier. And when kids get to latency and the parents begin to see how they're acting, often they give messages to try to counter the effects of the injunctions. And that's why they were originally called counter injunctions.
Could you kind of go over what you think are the time frames then? Are injunctions 0 to 6?
For the most part, injunctions are 0 to 6.
And then counter injunctions would be through adolescence?
Yes.
Okay, can you get counter injunctions? I'm thinking of the personality adaptations. Some of the survivings are formed 0 to 3. So you could have injunctions 0 to 3. Could you start picking up counter injunctions from 4 to 6 also?
Yes. Virginia Satir in her family therapy workshops used to do a really nice demonstration of that whole process. She would pick somebody from the audience and have them pretend to be her child. And she would have all these ropes and gags and blindfolds and stuff. And she would say, you're really a delightful little kid, but there are a lot of awful things in the world that I don't want you to see and be frightened about. So here I'm going to tie this blindfold around your eyes so you don't see those things. And, you're a wonderful child, but sometimes you are too loud and make too much noise and disturb other people. So I'm going to tie this rope around your waist so it's really tight, and that way you won't feel a whole lot and you won't disturb other people. You can trust me. I'm your mother. I'll take care of you. And, you're a wonderful child, but sometimes you just spontaneously run off. I'm afraid you're going to run in traffic, so here I'm going to tie your legs together so you won't run away and get hurt. And, you can trust me. I'll provide what you need. And, you're a beautiful child, but sometimes, you reach out and grab things that I'm afraid you're going to get burned by or hurt by. So here I'm going to tie your hands together. So, but you can trust me. I'll take care of you. I'll provide you with what you need. And she keeps going on like this, and the child is all bound and gagged and so forth and can barely move. And she says, okay, next I want you to imagine that Johnny here is about 8. Johnny, come over here. And of course the kid is going, can't move. Johnny, what's wrong with you? Come over here. Straighten up, act right. And that's what counter injunctions are. They're an attempt to counter those earlier messages that have bound and gagged the child in all kinds of ways. If you ask the mother, did you intentionally say those things to your kid? They'd say, of course not. I don't want my child to be that way. They were simply unconsciously communicated through implied behavior. If you ask them, did you say those counter injunctions to your child? They'd say, of course. Everybody knows that's the way you should act. So that's the difference. The injunctions bound us in all kinds of ways psychologically. And then parents often give us messages, directives to try to counter the effects. Yeah.
As you're talking about injunctions being real early, pre-verbal, just have a question about how this ties into attachment theory, if you have maybe a real broad way of looking at that.
Right. Yeah, if you think about the different forms of attachment, there is an anxious, basically, when the child attempts to separate, individuate, move away from the parent often gets upset, won't let the child come back and get their needs met, and the child gets anxious about moving away from the parent for fear that they're going to lose the parent. And that's the message. That's an example of don't grow up. For an avoidant attachment, when the child goes out and does their own thing, comes back and wants to get back in the relationship with mother and get comforted and so forth, mother might say, don't act that way, you're too big for that. And the child feels shamed about having attachment needs and decide, I won't need you, and goes out into the world in a kind of defiant way to attempt to convince themselves and everybody else they don't need anybody. And then there's a disorganized type of attachment where when the child moves away, mother pursues, or father, whoever the attachment figure is. When the child comes back, the parent moves back. So the parent is doing just the opposite of what the child needs. You know, normally when somebody moves toward you, you move toward them. When they move away, you move away. But in a disorganized, confused type of attachment, the child doesn't know what to do. And they tend to respond in the opposite. You know, when somebody approaches them, they sort of back up. When somebody moves away, they pursue. So you have all those different attachment styles, and they're very much related to the kinds of injunctions the child has gotten. Yeah.
Vann, do you think it's more the injunctions or the counter injunctions that determine the spot on the OK Corral?
There's some influence from both, but I think it's more the injunctions. Yeah.
And I'm not sure where this fits in, but what if one parent is just absent, like it's a workaholic and at work all day? What sort of message is that?
It's often a don't be close, because the child doesn't experience closeness with that parent. It can also imply that the child is not important. A lot of it depends on how the child experiences it and interprets it. So again, what parents do is only 50%. The other 50 is how the child interprets and responds to it. Yes?
Now, what would a complete absence from life be as far as injunctions go? Like, the parent has never been in the child's life.
Frequently, the child will interpret that as don't be or don't exist. That the parent would rather they not be there. But again, it really depends on the child's interpretation. But that's what I find frequently. Yeah.
You commented on how the Depression era children were often given a don't be a child.
Mm-hmm.
Where I'm seeing more and more are early 20-somethings with a don't grow up. Can you comment on what kind of social stuff that kind of makes the don't grow up message more prevalent?
Yes. In our society currently in the United States, there's more and more overindulgence of kids. And parents often keep the kids dependent on them by giving them money and don't allow the kids to go out and establish their own homes in terms of having to do that. One of the things I told my kids is once they finish college, it would be up to them to earn a living and support themselves in the world. They thought I was horrible because all their friends were setting them up in apartments and buying them cars and all this stuff, continuing to support them. And when parents do that, it's really giving the child a message not to grow up. Kids who often have the hardest time growing up are kids who have trust funds, because they know they never have to work or make it in the world. So when parents overindulge kids and do too much for kids like that, it can be a very negative effect for the child. They don't learn how to support themselves and be competent and do it on their own. And that's one of the problems of a very affluent society. We have the money to keep doling out, and often parents do that. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about script terminology. The counter-injunction messages plus the child's acquiescence, or just going along with that, equals what Byrne called the counter-script. For example, if in my family for 7 generations everybody had become an attorney, it goes without saying that the way you become successful is become an attorney. And if I just go along with that and never stop and think about, do I really want to be an attorney? Or had I rather be a baseball player or whatever? Then the child is said to be following their counter-script. Again, drivers are a specific group of universal counter-injunctions. All of us get the drivers to some degree. The script proper are the injunctions plus the child's decision. The program is the parent's modeling for how to carry out the injunctions. Any questions about that?
Sorry, Vann, could you just repeat what you said about counter-script and counter-injunctions and the child's, I can't even spell that, say that word.
Acquiescence.
Okay. Yeah.
Acquiescence. It simply means the child just going along with what the expectations are.
Okay.
So the counter script about what the child is supposed to do is made up from the counter injunctions plus the child going along with that. And yes, in the example I used about the attorney, the implied message is if you want to be a success in life, be an attorney. And if I simply go along with that and never think about, do I really want to be an attorney, or had I rather choose a different profession? Then I'm following my counter script. Because counter simply means counter to the injunctions. The injunction he might have gotten is don't succeed. He may have a counter injunction to be a successful attorney, but the psychological level message might be don't make it. So he's like the lawyer who is in front of the courtroom defending the case, but feeling really anxious.
So he could be following either the counter script or the script proper and still choose to be an attorney, in your example. Would that be correct?
No, because in a counter script he hasn't chosen. He's just going along with the expectations, and he never stops and thinks about what he really wants to do. That's the whole idea of a counter script.
Oh, I see. It's the decision versus the acquiescence.
Right. Exactly. You got it. Okay, what I'd like for you to do is go back to your matrix and imagine for a minute you're somewhere around 6 years of age, give or take a couple of years. And you're getting all these messages, both the counter injunctions and the injunctions. And just let yourself imagine being that 6-year-old and just get in touch with what you're feeling emotionally. And then just write that down on your paper. And as you're feeling that emotion, what are you concluding about your parents? And what are you concluding about yourself? For example, do you say, you're really smart? I must be dumb? Or, you're really messed up? I'm all right? Or, you're really mean? I'm unlovable? So what are you concluding about them as people, and what are you concluding about yourself as a child? And then as you're feeling that way and you're concluding certain things about your parents and about yourself, what are you deciding you're going to do in light of that to try to take care of yourself? And write that down. What are you deciding you're going to do in order to try to take care of yourself? And what's your fantasy about what will happen if you do that? This is basically the process that the kid goes through in making decisions about how they're going to be. For example, you might have gotten a don't make it injunction, and the primary feeling you're having as a 6-year-old is feeling anxious. And you might conclude about your parents, you know how to do this. I'm uncertain. So what I'm going to do is try as hard as I can to get it right. And that way, hopefully you'll approve of me. And then think about, if that doesn't work and things get bad enough, what will you do? And what's your fantasy about what will happen then? So I might decide, for example, if things get bad enough, I'll just run away, and then you'll be sorry, and you'll come after me, and you'll love me at last. And then think about what your favorite fairy tale or childhood story is. Could be a Bible story, it could be a cartoon, it could be a comic book character, superhero, whatever. And as you think about that story, first of all, think about how it goes. And second, what appeals to you about that story. Third, who do you identify with in the story? And then how does the story end? And think about how that story seems to fit your life, your own life as a kid. Has everybody gotten that far? So next, what I'd like for you to do is come back to the present and think about what keeps happening over and over again in your life in the present that you end up feeling the way you did at 6. And think about, first of all, how it starts, what happens first. Then what happens next? And then what happens? And how does it end? And what do you feel and tell yourself at the end? Okay, I think it's be a good time for a break. So let's stop here, and we'll take 15 minutes, and then afterwards we will talk about what Geek came up with. Okay, let's go ahead and get started back. Are there people who are willing to just share what you came up with? Starting at what you felt at 6, what you concluded about your parents and about yourself, what you decided to do, and so forth.
Okay, so I'm just going to start with how do I feel?
Yes.
So I wrote, how do I feel and think? And I put confused, conflicted, sad, discounted, lonely, abandoned, odd, a weirdo, unlovable.
Okay. And then what are you concluding about your parents and about yourself?
Okay, so I just put conclusion. So it's about parents and self.
Yes.
So I put be cautious, no one will ever understand me, and I'm the odd duck.
Okay.
And then what comes next about me?
And then what are you deciding you're going to do as a result to try
What will I do to take care of myself, which I have to tell you, this whole entire exercise was so awesome. I would love for you to just go through the steps with me again.
Okay.
It came back to the drivers.
Uh-huh.
I wrote down, be strong, try harder, adapt.
Okay.
Is that what normally happens?
It depends on the person.
Because I'm still 6 years old, right?
Right.
As I'm doing this, I'm still 6. So it's like
Right.
I got to try harder to get you to love me.
Right. And what's your fantasy about what will happen if you do that?
That I'll be okay. I'll fit in. No one will criticize me, or people will stop criticizing me. I will be accepted.
Good. Okay. And then if things get bad enough?
If things get real bad, I'll leave you and you'll be sorry.
Uh-huh.
And my fantasy about that is I'll be missed and you'll change.
Right. So you see how the early decision is a magical way to try to get back to a position of okayness, to get the unconditional love and acceptance that we're not getting as a kid, or feel like we're not getting. What was your favorite fairy tale or childhood story?
My favorite childhood story is The Velveteen Rabbit.
And tell us how that goes.
It's about this boy who is very sick. I think he has scarlet fever. And so he has this little rabbit that comes in bed with him, a little stuffed toy, and because the boy is sick so much, and the rabbit is there, always there for him, the stuffed toy's fur comes off.
Mm-hmm.
And he just is torn and tattered. And the parents throw it out when the child gets well. And at least this is how I remember the story.
Right.
And then when the rabbit gets thrown out, he becomes real. He becomes a real rabbit. And he goes into the forest, and he's automatically accepted by the other rabbits.
Uh-huh.
So,
and what appeals to you about that story?
that he gets a new life, that he helps the boy heal, and then he moves on, and that he is accepted unconditionally.
Uh-huh. No wonder you became a therapist.
I'm a trainer, actually, but I think I'm a therapist in many ways. But anyway,
Exactly.
so now after the story,
who do you identify with in the story?
oh, the rabbit, for sure the rabbit.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so that's what so maybe I skipped something, and that's all what I wrote about the rabbit.
Okay. And how does that story seem to fit your life as a child?
I think I missed that question.
Well, you actually sort of already have answered it.
Okay, good, good. Because there were all those questions I didn't get, which I do want to get.
Yeah.
Okay.
It sounds like you were feeling like the rabbit, discarded.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Or I was the boy who just wanted someone to love me like the rabbit loved him.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, usually we can play all the different parts.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we identify with all the different parts to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
And coming back to the present, what keeps happening over and over again in the present that you end up feeling the way you did at 6?
Well, I experienced a lot of self-doubt, but then I carried that through, and then I wrote, I get help, I'm okay as I am, I have choices, and then I'm free, I'm loved, I'm lovable, I live in the present, and I'm happy.
Good. That's neat. Thank you. So, does that give you a sense of how, from the messages that we get, we interpret those in a certain way, make decisions about them, which are designed to try to solve the problem of how to get unconditional love and acceptance? And then we often find the story in which what's happening to the character in the story existentially feels like it fits our life. So the magic becomes, if I can just make my life go like that story, I too can end up living happily ever after. Or if I can't do that, maybe at least I can get revenge, like Robin Hood or somebody, you know. So it depends on the story. And then often outside of our awareness, we replay that over and over again in our current life until we bring all that into awareness and realize we have other choices and can then from an autonomous place make new decisions about how we're going to be in the world.